Ka huki mahara ki te honga wairua, ko rātou I hinga atu puto no I te motu, haere, haere, hari atu rā koutou. Ka mihi ki a tātou, kua tau mai nei, I runga I te kaupapa o tēnei hui, ngā reo, ngā mana, e rauranga tira mā, tēnā koutou, a tēnā hoki tātou katoa. Ko Tararawa, te ao Pauri, ngati kahu ngā iwi, ko ora whana te maunga, ko rangi heke te awa, ko Pariwhero, te hapu, ko Manukau tuku marae, ko Mariah Karaka tuku māma, ko Margaret Dudley ahau. Kia ora everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today. So I've just realised 20 years ago was when I graduated as a clinical psychologist, and I was equipped with my little kit, I think it was the Waisa back in those days, and I thought I was going to go out and save the world, or at least save those Māori who had suffered from a neurological condition. But over time I've become quite disillusioned about the neuropsychological interface with Māori, and I have become more and more convinced that Māori are at disadvantage when they are being assessed within this process. So I chose this topic for my presentation today because despite quite a large body of evidence, particularly international evidence, supporting the argument that culture is a confounding variable in neuropsych testing, some neuropsychologists nevertheless continue to work with little or no consideration of this fact. So it is an area that I am passionate about. I've done a fair amount of research into it and I've talked about it forever, it appears. So I'm really very happy to be here today. So let me talk about and explain the context of my kōrero today, but you never asked me anything I know. So a few years ago I conducted some research and I was developing a Māori normative database for the WACE-4. And I just finished administering the whole of the WACE-4 to this particular Māori woman, and of course my sample the sample that I was working with did not have a history of with a neurological condition, because I was seeking normative data. And so we became to the end of the testing. I said to her, ko motu tēnei mahi, this work is finished, we're finished. And she looked at me, almost with a look of horror on her face. And after a pause, she turned to me and she said, "But you haven't asked me anything I know." And she actually followed that statement up with this statement. She said, "You have only asked me questions that show how much I have been colonised." And that kind of stayed with me, those statements stayed with me, because I think in a nutshell, it's what I had been sensing and what I had been thinking over previous years. I felt really bad at that point. So this woman's life was largely immersed in Te Ao Māori, in the Māori world. Even though she had grown up in Auckland, she was bicultural. She had lived in a New Zealand provincial town for quite a few years, and she was a prominent member and leader of the local kapahaka group, and they competed at a national level, so they're very competitive. Her children attended kohanga reo and kura kaupapa. All of her social life was immersed within her whānau, and of course that social life, the marae, was central to their social life, or central to their lives per se. She was a very bright woman and had been educated in mainstream schooling, and she performed in the above average range on the WACE-4. There was another participant in that same study, a well-respected and educated man. In fact, he was the chairman of the local runanga, and halfway through the assessment he just came to a stop. He turned to me and he said, the average person in Kaitaia wouldn't have a clue about this stuff. So, and once again, I knew where he was coming from. And so they're quite mild statements compared to some of the statements that have been directed at me over the years by young people or by people that I have conducted neuropsych assessments with. A lot of the clients who I have assessed over the years come into this process and they see it as a Pākehā process. And they become very angry and very frustrated. I've been sworn at numerous times over the years. I had a chair thrown at me once. I had a table with all the materials upturned and everything go flying. And I have had a number of clients walk out mid-assessment. So I understand where they're coming from because actually I feel some of that frustration as well. Many of those who do stay do not really engage in the assessment process. And this lack of engagement and motivation in that assessment process impacts their performance so that the neuropsychologist is probably obtaining scores that are erroneous anyway. So I do try to make the experience better particularly for the Māori clients that I have seen over the years. So the instructions that I use to administer the tasks, I do that in a less formal way, as is written down, as you should be doing it as per the manual. I use words from te reo when I can. I'm not a fluent speaker of te reo, but I know a fair amount. I change the names and the stories to Māori names. And generally, I just conduct the assessment in a manner that is more in keeping with tikanga Māori. So people ask me, why do you do this? I do persevere with this challenge because I believe that Māori who experience neurological assault can and should benefit from neuropsychology. It has a lot to offer. But I think we need to do it in a way that is Māori friendly and responsive to Māori needs. And anyway, neuropsychological assessments are going to continue to be applied to Māori on a daily basis, so to hundreds of Māori throughout the mutu, so really bailing out is not an option for me. So my korero today is not based on complex psychometric data about how Māori perform on neuropsych testing. Actually, very little psychometric investigation into this area has been done in this country. But rather, I want to talk about what I and others have observed over the years about the experiences of Māori who undergo a neuropsych assessment. First of all, what is the purpose of a neuropsych assessment? It's to help identify neurological dysfunction and guide differential diagnosis. Also to identify any changes in cognitive and strengths and weaknesses over time that might have occurred. And 3, to use this information to guide recommendations regarding everyday life and treatment planning. Simply put, a neuropsychological assessment is there to help the client make sense of their world and to provide strategies that help them manage that world. But this is problematic when your client, or this could possibly be problematic when your client is from another culture and has another worldview, and you, the neuropsychologist, are not too familiar with that worldview. And this was clearly demonstrated to me once when a colleague of mine, he was a Pākehā neuropsychologist, he did an assessment on a young Māori lad, well, I think he was in his early 20s, and he did the assessment, and then he made all the recommendations. And for all intents and purposes, he was very happy with the report. He thought that he had done a good job. So further down the track, he actually became that person's therapist as well. So a lot of us neuropsychologists are clinical psychologists as well. So we actually do end up, and that's probably the case for lots of us. So we do end up providing therapeutic intervention as well. And when he went home to that person's house, he looked around and he felt really bad because he realised that the recommendations that he had he had made for that client were totally inappropriate. They just weren't going to work. So he had a glimpse into that client's world, and of course that just changed the whole manner in which recommendations and treatment followed on from there. So fortunately he was able to change the recommendations, or to implement recommendations or interventions that were actually going to be applied and adhered to, and therefore make a difference. Cross-cultural neuropsychology is a clinical or research encounter where there are significant cultural or language differences between the examiner, examinee, informant's test and or social context. I believe here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that cultural differences between many Māori clients, and I don't talk for all Māori, but for many Māori clients and for some neuropsychologists, is greater than what is assumed. And as a consequence of this assumption, Māori identity gets lost in the process, because for some reason I think a lot of and this is just my thoughts that I have from listening to other neuropsychologists, by listening to them present case studies over the years. My thought is that a lot of neuropsychologists go on there and think we're all one people, that we have this Kiwi culture that we all adhere to, and really don't know a lot about Māori culture. I'm not here today to criticise all neuropsychologists. Indeed, many do work in a culturally safe way and competent way. But I do believe there is a heck of a lot of work that neuropsychologists should be doing when working with Māori, and indeed when working with anybody from a different cultural or linguistic background. Our discipline continues to be practiced in a very Eurocentric manner. So in order to understand really about cultural bias in neuropsych testing, you have to look at the history of the development of intelligence testing. And it is not surprising that cultural bias exists in neuropsychology, even if you just take a cursory look at the history of the development of intelligence testing. The birth of IQ testing as we know it began around, as we all know, the early 20th century in the USA, and was for many years steeped in racist ideology and biological determinism. And this belief system was generally held by the majority of white American society at the time. So many of those men who were instrumental in the early stages of IQ testing development were no more racist than their contemporaries. However, there were a number of them who were zealous members of the eugenics movement. So it wasn't really until the publication of the Mismeasure of Man in 1981 by Stephen Gould that IQ testing came under criticism and scrutiny. Gould critiqued and challenged the statistical methods and cultural motivations underlying biological determinism, which he defined as the abstraction of intelligence as a single entity, its location within the brain, its quantification as one number for each individual, and the use of these numbers to rank people in a single series of worthiness, invariably to find that oppressed and disadvantaged groups, races, classes, or sexes are innately inferior and deserve their status. And so intelligence testing, which had previously evolved relatively unchallenged in racist ideology, became the subject of intense and often emotive debate, and still is today. So he's a good guy. Charles Matthew, so this is a clip out of Charles Matthew's speech, his inaugural speech as president of the International Neuropsych Society in 1992. But we do wonder if things have changed very much since then. So Charles Matthew had conducted thousands of neuropsych assessments on Hispanic people in the US. However, still, even today, all the neuropsych measures that we use here in Aotearoa have been developed either in the US or the UK, as I'm sure all of you know, by Western people and therefore reflect a Western worldview. No other worldviews are considered, and certainly not a Māori worldview. I find it really interesting when people say to me, well, this is a culturally fair test, but who has deemed it to be culturally fair? Even Western people are defining what is culturally fair. Unless it's been developed amongst Māori, we don't consider it to be culturally fair. Let's look at some of the data. So on your left, it's the most recent up-to-date data we have, and it shows the picture of Māori being overrepresented both in TBI, and you can see in this data that the incidence for Māori increases in the adolescent years and remains higher throughout the life course, more so than any other population. And the stroke data on the right shows that overall the incidence of Māori is slightly less than Pacifica, but more than Pākehā, except around the years of 85 plus, and that is probably because Māori do not live that long, or not so many Māori. So I put this slide up, and this is data from the Bionic study again, broken down by gender, but it is the green line that is of interest in that it represents those Māori who have experienced a TBI who presented for medical attention. So not many of them, as you can see. So this data supports what we know about Māori who do not seek medical attention irrespective of what the health condition is. This is fairly recent data that has come out of the memory clinic at Middlemore Hospital. And as you can see, Auquia and Kaumātua are about 8.5 years younger than non-Māori when they receive their diagnosis of dementia. So the purpose of showing you all this data is to demonstrate the high incidence of Māori suffering from conditions where they frequently are required to undergo a neuropsych assessment. Oh yes, so the implications of neuropsychology, of course, go much further in that. There are wide social implications for neuropsych assessment in Māori. Māori are also routinely administered neuropsych assessments if they are present in the justice system, the education system, and oranga tamariki, in fact, in many areas of society. And as most of us know, the reports that are generated in those organisations or in those areas of society are very powerful and can significantly impact on people's and whānau's lives. So it's not just the world of neurology or neuropsychology where neuropsych assessment has an impact on Māori. Brickman, Carbo and Manley, they are internationally recognised cross-cultural neuropsychologists. Jennifer Manley, hopefully we're going to get out here later on next year. And they state that it's not race or ethnicity per se that causes the variability in test performance, but rather indicators of factors within a cultural background that are responsible for the difference. And they identify two of these factors as being acculturation and education. And from my experience, I agree with this, that these two factors hugely influence how Māori perform on neuropsych assessment. In my opinion, Māori who are less acculturated fare worse, more disadvantaged on the neuropsych testing than those who are more acculturated. These two variables have been consistently substantiated in the international literature as impacting performance, and here are two quotes by very prominent cultural neuropsychologists as well. And I won't read them out because I know you can all read. So just like I was fishing around on Google the other day, and I came across this video, which I hope is going to work.
Honey, you never walked away from a test before. Tell us what's really bothering you.
Mama, they don't know it, but that IQ exam was nothing but a white racist test.
Oh, Michael, how could it be a white racist test? All school children take it of all colors.
Yeah, but this one was given by the white people, made up by white people, and even graded by white people. It don't tell you how smart you are, just how white you are. That's why they ask questions on a test like this. Complete the following phrase, cup and you have to choose from 4 words, wall, saucer, table, and window. You know what my friend Eddie put down? Cup and table. Because in his house, they don't have no saucers to put under the cup.
You know something, when I was a kid, we didn't have no saucers to put on the table either.
And get this question. A mother and father and 2 children live in a 5-bedroom residence. The mother and father sleep in 1 bedroom, and each of the 2 children has a room to himself. How many guest bedrooms are there left? Now, how many kids in the ghetto even know what a guest bedroom is?
Yeah.
So, as I said, in my opinion, and it is my opinion at this point in time, because we don't have the psychometric data to back it up, but those who are less acculturated are more disadvantaged. In the US, they do have measures of acculturation. So, in their research, they are able to control for that variable. Unfortunately, we don't have such a measure here in Aotearoa. So the skills and knowledge that are required to do well on neuropsych tests are mostly acquired in a formal school setting. And for example, and particularly the verbal skills, for example, vocabulary, which is a common type of subtest within a battery of tests. And so those types of tests are influenced by exposure to a wide range of words. This exposure to words typically occurs, as I said, in the education system. But many Māori, not all, but many Māori have had a negative experience in the school system in New Zealand. And actually, I think that neuropsychologists really, in terms of their cultural competency, really do need to know about the education system and how it has failed Māori in terms of throughout history. And it sounds like, oh, here's another Māori bleating on about this, but really, even if you look at it from a purely neutral stance, you have to see that the education system was never there to promote the well-being of Māori in terms of education. The tides are turning, I understand that, and we do have some fairly good data out there now where Māori are doing much better, but of course there are a lot of Māori who continue to not do well within the formal school setting. These quotes on this slide, they are from the Ogden and McFarlane study in 1997. But as I've said, I've heard many of these types of comments over the years. As I said, a lot of these people don't really engage in the neuropsych assessment process, and I think that's a major problem because we all know that to do well in a neuropsych assessment, we're looking for your optimal performance. If you're going to not be engaged right from the get-go, then everything that follows is erroneous. Many of the people who present, Māori who present for a neuropsych assessment, they just put up with the process because they have to, but others show their frustration, as I've already explained. So I've put up this slide on method bias and what that is. And you don't really hear a lot about method bias, but I think that this is a major factor to consider when we are evaluating Māori, when we are assessing Māori in the neuropsych setting. It does explain a lot of the variance seen in scores produced by some Māori. There are many other types of biases and types of validity, I know, and we are all aware of that as psychologists, but I just really wanted to put this one up today because it's not one that comes up so often, and we'll just focus on this. So an area that's, to me, that is really problematic in terms of neuropsych assessment is establishing pre-morbid ability for Māori. And so to evaluate the impact of neurological injury on cognitive performance, it is typically necessary to derive a baseline or pre-morbid estimate of a person's general cognitive ability prior to the onset of impairment. The NART, the National Adult Reading Test, the test of pre-morbid functioning and spot the word, popular measures utilised for this purpose. And typically the clinician will combine scores on these measures with other information such as school records, how the person had performed at school, their employment history, what the person might have achieved in other areas of their life in order to help corroborate and use that as information to corroborate pre-morbid ability evaluation. But for those Māori who have had a negative experience at school and subsequently go on to live a life that often follows such an experience, the gathering of this information is not providing any insight into the person's level of intelligence. This is a way of, this way of establishing pre-morbid ability is just another form of systematic racism. It's a systemic practice that perpetuates inequity for Māori. This is also known as institutionalised racism, and it is potent because of its subtleness. By the way, I recently did do some psychometric research, or myself and one of my students, Kelly, Scott, who is here today, and we did find that the top is not, and that I think is probably the most common tool for establishing pre-morbid ability today in Aotearoa, is not a good measure of for PA, for pre-morbid ability in Māori. I myself prefer spot the word when trying to establish this function with Māori. And so I shouldn't really be showing you these too much because, you know, there's practice effect and all that. But this is the National Adult Reading Test. And I just kind of, those of you who don't know about neuropsych testing or cognitive testing don't have any idea really of what our people are put through. So the person is shown a card and they read down the left side and then down the right side, and they go as far as they can until I think 10 mistakes are made, and then they stop, and then you're scored. So reading ability is considered, this is the top, is considered to be, is considered to stay relatively intact after neurological insult. So, yeah, generally our people, and once again this is anecdotal, generally Māori balk don't like this type of test. So I just want to sort of look at some of the research that I have done. I have no idea what the time is. Okay, I've got miles to go. Okay, so some of the research that I've done over the years. So this was a short-term postdoc which I did at AUT, and so it was, what I did was I went around mainly Auckland and the north of Auckland and interviewed people who had undergone a neuropsych assessment in the previous 5 years. However, you know, it's really amazing how widespread we are, because I did manage to kōrero to interview people from a vast range of iwi. Whenever I do any research with Māori, it is very important that we try and incorporate and include as many iwi as we can. Sometimes that's a bit difficult because of the parameters around funding and so on and so forth, but you know, you don't want to leave anybody out. You want to include everybody, and then it makes it more amenable or more acceptable to Māori per se. So anyway, even though we did from Auckland upwards, we did manage to capture people from a fairly wide range of iwi. So I've only just put 2 themes up here today which I think are relevant, and we have published on this. And so Māori preferred these certain ways of doing things. Most Māori clients that I spoke to preferred to have a Māori clinician, and this is a common thought from Māori who I have spoken with or worked with or have interviewed or assessed over the years. I have a lot of, I have often had Pākehā clinicians or colleagues say to me, oh, but the person that I interviewed wasn't concerned whether I was Māori or Pākehā. And I just kind of really worry about that because, I think you need to consider why is that person answering in that way. I mean, it might be so, it might not be. There may be a variety, a number of reasons why that person is not identifying with their culture. My advice is to, sort of take that information, but don't just take it. I feel it's just that the impression I've got is that with some people that have said that to me, it's really convenient. It fits well because they feel comfortable. They feel comfortable. The assessor feels comfortable because we don't, I don't have to do the Māori thing. I'm not very good at it. I'm not very confident. And so on they go without taking that into consideration. But there are many reasons why Māori say that, there can be many reasons why Māori say they don't identify with their culture. And what I suggest is that you take that information, you park it up. You just put it there, you don't dismiss it outright. And somewhere, particularly if you're having an ongoing relationship with that person, that actually their cultural identity might come to the fore and might be, in fact, be a crucial part of the healing process. So remember, just park it up. All Māori, virtually all Māori, want to start off with karakia. Once again, we teach on the Doctorate of Clinical Psychology. We teach our students, we regularly ask them to do karakia so that when they go out into the big wide world, they are comfortable with it. It's not something they're not unsure of, and therefore it's not awkward. Sure, not all Māori clients are going to require a karakia, but a lot will. And when you're working in this area of health, you're working with the brain, you're working with the head. So the body, the whole tinana is tapu, but the head is the most tapu part of the body. And so many Māori won't proceed unless they have this karakia. And so the other aspects of preferred ways of doing things, I'm sure you would have been familiar with. But actually the big theme that came through, and really is what today's talk is about, is cultural invisibility. Māori had nothing to do with it. I just put my ethnicity on the form. I told him I was tūhoi, but I could see it didn't mean anything to him. This particular statement, and that guy who said it, I will never forget him. And so I was interviewing him as part of my research, as I said, about his neuropsychological assessment experience. And so this guy was in his late 20s, maybe early 30s. He had a motor vehicle accident and he had a serious traumatic brain injury. Prior to the accident, he had a very successful building business, I think it was at the time. He had a beautiful big home in Tauranga. He had a really gorgeous wife and beautiful children. And so he was doing well. And then, of course, he had this accident, severe TBI. When I went and saw him, he was living in a paddock, in a caravan, in a broken down caravan. Half the roof was missing because he had left the gas stove on. And, of course, a fire had occurred. And he was just like such a different person. His job was he was tending market gardens for the local iwi. This is down in the Waikato. And anyway, he said this to me when I asked him if culture had been a part of his assessment. But what was saddened to me was that all that he had prior to the head injury, prior to the accident, had gone. But what he did retain was his pride in his tūhoi, in his tūhoiness, in his tūhoi iwi. That meant everything to him. And you could see just by watching him and listening to him how proud he was of his Māori identity. But the neuropsychologist didn't get that, and it went right over the head. So, that was such a golden opportunity to engage with that client, to develop a therapeutic relationship with that client, but also to get the client to engage in the neuropsych assessment. So, that really, I suppose when I hear quips like this, comments like this, to me it's like, in a nutshell, this is what I'm trying to get at. They can say it in their own words far better than what I can. So I also, couple of years ago, was funded to develop a Māori normative database for the Waste 4. So we conducted research over I think 5 different settings throughout the country. We had a sample of 280 people who self-identified as Māori, which is a really good number of people for a normative database, because a lot of the normative databases in terms of sample number are notoriously low. So I was really pleased about that, stratified for age and gender and all the rest of it. And we had obviously a very wide range of iwi that were represented. I was really hoping to say to you today that those findings or that database is published, but it isn't. It's there all ready to go, and so I've made a commitment that it will be published. That normative database, a Māori normative database for the Waste 4, will be published before Christmas. Since I've been at the University of Auckland lecturing, it's just been impossible to find the time. Oh, so this is just looking at the assessment itself. It took 2 to 3 hours. We not only administered the Waste 4, we also we used the multi-dimensional model of Māori identity and cultural engagement, the MICE, in lieu of or as a proxy for an acculturation measure. And of course, we did the test of pre-morbid functioning. And from that actual study, that's where we did further analysis on the top and found that it was not a good measure of pre-morbidity for Māori. So we did find that results indicate acculturation, education, income and client comfort. It may account for some of the variance in test performance. I mean, this is when you're looking at client comfort, at how the person engages, you can't put a number on it. So there's always going to be a grey area in there, and it's not until you get a large body of evidence that you can sort of give some sort of certainty to these types of claims. So we have to say may have accounted for some of the performance variance in test performance. These are the authors that I'm aware of that have done qualitative research on Māori and neuropsych testing. Not a lot, as you can see. I apologise if anybody's in the room or I haven't included your work. These are just some of the examples, and I've just thrown this in, of inappropriate questions. Inappropriate, what I mean is that Māori don't like them. What does shallow brooks and noisy, what does that mean? I think when I was first administered the waste, I didn't know what it meant. I do know what it means now, it just seems so easy to me, but it's such a foreign word. One frost does not make a winter, and yeah, sure, you can kind of figure it out if you're from a Western world view, but when you're from a Māori world view, you just might as well be talking another language. And questions, the comprehension subtest and the information subtest, sure, they're not core subtests, they're not used a lot, but they are used, and it really reflects, where the tests, how the tests are made, where they come from, and just, the whole feeling, the whole background of the neuropsych assessment. I mean, who was Catherine the Great? Of course, I had to ask these tests when I was obtaining normative data for Māori. I had to ask every question in every subtest. It was so embarrassing to ask who was Catherine the Great. It was embarrassing to ask who wrote Hamlet. I mean, I knew that. I mean, it was just really embarrassing. Okay, Edmund and Hillary, that was okay. Richard William Pearce, of course, I didn't know who that was to begin with. And, to be honest, some of these people you ask, I don't even think their teachers would know, to be honest. And of course, in the vocabulary subtest, Gary McFarlane Nathan, he administered the vocab subtest to his sample of young Māori men, and they got scored wrong on their explanations of terminate because they said, it was to kill somebody, and so they were marked wrong. But actually, it's not wrong. In our world, or in their world, it is to kill somebody. So why are we being marked wrong? It's just another worldview. Domestic, in their world, was to have a fight or an argument with their partner. And once again, they were being marked wrong. Scoring criteria needs to encompass, that's one thing that we are looking at in terms of a test that we are developing. I'll talk to you about that in a moment. We're looking at the scoring criteria so that it is including information, mātauranga Māori, knowledge from the Māori world, because it's not wrong, it's just different from what's in the book. So, the usual story, how do we improve current neuropsychological practices when evaluating Māori? Develop our own tests. I mean, that's a dream, and that is probably not a reality, in fact. Because one of the problems with that is that we don't really have a Māori workforce in neuropsychology. And, this takes a lot of time to do this type of work, and a lot of funding, I might add, as well. But we just don't have the workforce. So things don't move very much on that particular level, although I have got some good news I'll tell you in a moment. To develop Māori normative data, which, as I said, I've done for the WACE and to be published. Obviously, train more Māori neuropsychologists, and just recently, or just outside, I met somebody who said they were interested in this area, and I'm always looking for Māori students to come through to train as neuropsychologists. But unfortunately, most of our Māori students get, pulled off into other areas. Because there's such a desperate need for Māori students everywhere. But I'm a PI with Brain Research New Zealand, and so, they're handing me money on a plate, virtually, but I just need to, find the students to do the mahi. It's very frustrating. So ideally to train more Māori neuropsychologists. By the way, if you know of any Māori students or young Māori academics who are interested, please send them my way. Develop cultural competency in non-Māori neuropsychologists. And this means so that the neuropsychologist is comfortable with including aspects of other cultures into the neuropsych process. All neuropsychologists, as I said, should have a knowledge of New Zealand history. And this is across the board, irrespective of what area of health you're working in. You cannot work with Māori unless you have an understanding and appreciation and some sort of empathy about where Māori have been, where they've come from, and why we are in the place that we are today. We have to have an understanding and be able to critique the negative impacts of colonisation on Māori. Somebody a couple of days ago asked me if I would talk about some of the dementia research that I was doing, and I thought, I wasn't originally going to talk about this, but actually it is all relevant. The Lilac study started in 2010. It's a longitudinal study looking at the living in advanced age for, I think there's well over 1,000, could even be 2,000 elderly people in New Zealand. It's a huge study run by Ngāi Kirst up in School of Population Health. And there were 420 Māori men and women aged 80 to 90 years in the study in the Bay of Plenty and the Lakes District. So what happened on that particular study was that the modified mini mental state exam was administered to those Māori participants by a research assistant. And a lot of those Māori participants scored below the cut-off point. So the implication was they had cognitive impairment. But when the clinician, usually a psychiatrist who came in later on, who followed up with an interview, a clinical interview, of course those people were found not to have cognitive impairment. Those people indeed were not found to have dementia. And so Ngāi Kirst was talking to me about this, and we both agreed, and it's not rocket science, that it's the tool that's wrong, because the tool did not factor in the cultural and educational background of those elderly Māori people. So the good thing is, what came out of that was a whole group of us senior Māori health researchers got together, and with a whole group of non-Māori health researchers and specialists in the area of dementia, along with our kaumātua advisory group, and we decided to apply for funding so that we could develop a tool that would accurately detect cognitive impairment or dementia in queer and kaumātua. And so we applied for funding and we were successful. And I think it's the largest funding that has taken place in terms of Māori and dementia in New Zealand to date. So there were 7 locations that we visited. We had 15 focus groups, wānanga focus groups, well over 200 queer and kaumātua altogether that we interviewed, and we had 8 whānau interviews, which Lisa Nathan in the Waikato conducted, and she's doing her master's thesis on that. And Lisa's over there somewhere. So the purpose of that research is to gather all this data, and I've got a huge database, and with that data, we are going to use that data to inform the development of a cognitive tool and a functional tool. And also another tool, part of the tool, and this is for detecting dementia, and another part of the tool, because the queer and kaumātua have told us quite strongly that whatever we do, we must include the concept of wairua within our measure, within our screen, within whatever the tool is going to be when we finally get it finished. So we are basing the tool loosely on the Kimberley Indigenous Cognitive Assessment tool, which was developed for Aborigines in the northwest of Australia, and which a systematic review has just come out and has shown that it's a very successful in detecting dementia. And in fact, I've been over there and met with the developers and met with some of the local Kimberley people, and they really like the tool because it's friendly, because because they were involved, their knowledge was involved in developing it. So I've only got 5 minutes, and it's a shame because this is just my baby at the moment. I'm just so in love with it, because it is a neuropsychologist's dream, a cultural neuropsychologist's dream, is to develop our own tools. And this is an opportunity that has come along for me. So when the tool is developed, so we're working on it right this very at the moment. We will pilot and validate it, and then we want to roll it out so that it is in use by clinicians and throughout all the DHBs. We will disseminate widely, and so there is actually a lot of interest and excitement about this tool out there currently. So I did want to tell you about that. So they asked me to talk about my dementia research, so I have. So, and these are just the people that are involved in that research. So, I want to pay tribute to my colleague and bro, Gary McFarlane Nathan. Gary was the first and one of the few Māori to conduct research into Māori and neuropsychology, and his work is widely cited. He was a very clever man, and he was passionate about helping Māori, particularly those clients who everybody else put in the too hard basket. His passing has been devastating, particularly for those Māori living in the north who suffer from TBI or some other neurological disease. When he was alive, he made a real difference to those people's lives, and they loved him. And I know this because I actually interviewed a lot of them in my research, and because many of them told us that when they attended his tangi. So I want to finish off with another quote that has stuck in my mind over the years. One guy, when asked if there was any cultural aspect to his neuropsych assessment, said, nah. He said, it's a Pākehā place. You don't expect cultural acknowledgement. As a Māori, you always feel different going into anything that's Pākehā. I'm 60 years old. Nothing in my life leads me to expect that. That's just a fact. And so that deeply saddened me. I hope things have changed or are changing. That deeply saddened me to think that some of our people have come to expect that our culture will be invisible. And this is just not acceptable. In a neuropsych assessment, how are Māori meant to perform well when we are constantly being undermined and devalued by the exclusion of our culture? When we are being assessed within a context that is unfamiliar and foreign to many of us and irrelevant to many of us? In a discipline that is proud of its scientific basis, this is not good science. Furthermore, neuropsychology should be practiced in a manner that observes the basic ethical rule of modern medicine: first, do no harm. But I'm not convinced that what we do is not harmful to many Māori. We saw this in the Lilac study, where people were inaccurately being identified with cognitive impairment. And I often wonder about people like the woman who made the statement for this presentation. What would her cognitive profile look like if the assessment included Mātauranga Māori, that reflected a Māori worldview, that reflected her worldview? Have we underestimated the cognitive abilities of many other Māori who have been through this process? And what are the implications of that? In order for Māori to be healthy, our healthcare needs to be embedded within our culture. That is, from first contact through to the assessment, to the formulation, through to assessment, through to treatment plans and care. We need to drop the centuries-old Cartesian model of healthcare for all people, not only Māori, and adopt a holistic approach as seen in the Māori models of health that encompass all aspects of well-being. Māori healing is an encompassing journey with many on board the waka moving forward. Māori ways of healing, in fact, have a lot to offer the world and can benefit all people in all countries. So just to finish off, I thought I would spare you having to listen to me sing a waiata. Instead, I have a clip of the Koe and Kaumātua who sung to us at the first hui we held for Kaumātuatanga o Te Roro in Kaitaia. Tēnei korero, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Do you see any opportunity to extend normative data sets to things like employment testing?
To the what testing?
To things like employment testing?
Well, yes, that would be, it's okay, I heard this question. That would be a natural graduation from, but of course, as I said, who's going to do it? It kind of probably, non-Māori can do it as long as they're consulting well or working alongside Māori. Yes, absolutely. Those tests that are used for employment opportunities for employing people are also very biased. So yeah, absolutely, definitely.
Kia ora. I work in Northland in Taitokoro, and recently I too had a very embarrassing experience whereby I select my questionnaires carefully to be self-perspective measures where possible. However, with a young person's whānau, I got the mama to check the question. She was not happy with it. So I made the decision to withdraw and not administer the test. And she wept and said that she had never had anyone do that before, and she thanked me for that. But it was very embarrassing because we then had to move to a place where we look ethically how we can get the young person to access services, because of course the services require X number of assessment tools or a diagnostic. So in terms of moving forward and designing own tools, I'm wondering if we can what we've agreed is to use Dr. Rose Perry's Te Wheki model and explore the deeper meaning, but obviously with some strong cultural advice and support.
Yes, yeah.
But that in itself is limited.
Yes.
So it's a big challenge.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, and we've just what we've done so far is a drop in the ocean. There's so much work to do. I was involved with the evaluation of the STQ, and so even that was culturally inappropriate, according to our Māori parents, and so this type of. So the questions that were being asked and were seen in a negative light, it came from a place of deficit rather than a strength-based place. And so Māori parents didn't like the SDQ at all. But actually, that was a study that was commissioned by the Ministry of Health, and they didn't actually like our findings. It didn't go down well. It was published in an overseas journal, but yes. So what is right and what is positive behaviour for Māori can be quite different. So it's right across the board, isn't it?
Thank you.
Kia ora.
Just along the lines of all those other psychometrics that we use that enable people to access services, I think that you're right, the deficit focus
Yes.
of those is really difficult, and under-reporting of problems.
Yes.
That a lot of families report too positively and so don't get access to services for
Yes. Yeah, I mean that's just it's a problem that, and I think some parents will respond according to what they think that might lead to.
I would say that the test publishers have a responsibility to fund some of your work in this area.
Yes.
They make a great deal of money out of many of these instruments,
Yes.
so I would like to suggest that maybe they could be approached to put some money behind this.
Yes, and I think actually Pearson's have taken this on. Is that right, Chris? One of the new tests for young children, the Wexler primary and preschool and primary screen, I think has got a has actually been standardised on an New Zealand population with a Māori cohort. Would you know? Sorry, Chris. Somebody can answer that? I'm fairly sure that, but you're dead right. You're absolutely right. It is the funding, it is the publishing companies that need to take responsibility. I have had some conversations with them, but once again, I can only do so much. Yeah. Are they? Okay. All right. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, we should go and hit up Pearson. They're sitting outside.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Students. Kia ora, kia koutou.